Hey everyone, this is Heine Zachariasen here, host of this podcast and the founder of Vivino, the world's largest wine community. Today we have a very, very exciting episode. We're going to talk about Vivino's data, and we have two people from academia that have done some extensive research in looking at Vivino data compared to wine specialists, wine experts. So incredibly excited about this conversation. Stick around. So I want to give a big welcome to our two guests today, Pantelis and Orestis. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you guys are visiting from Odense in Denmark and Munich in Germany. Thank you both for being here. I think the topic today is something the listeners are going to like, and I'm personally very excited. I love numbers, I love data, and that's somewhat what Vivino is too, so I'm super excited. Pantelis, Pipergias Analytis, is an assistant professor at the University of Southern Denmark, specializing in mathematical computational models of individual and group behavior. Orestis, Greek names, man. I am good at this. No, let's see how it goes. Orestis Kopsacheilis is a behavioral economist working at the Technical University of Munich. His work focuses on decision-making under risk and uncertainty, combining experimental research with practical insights. Okay, so you're both Greek, but you work in Denmark and in Germany, right?
That's right.
How did that happen?
Correct. So, that's a long story, right? So,
let's do the short version. That's good.
So, academia, actually the job market is global. That means that you apply all around the globe, and then also you get offers where you don't really expect it. But, in my case, I was coming from the United States. I was at Cornell University before that. Okay. And then I landed two job offers, one in Denmark and the other in the Netherlands. Okay. Well, my partner happened to be Danish at that time, and it made also a lot of sense for her job-wise. So, here I am.
This is often what happens, the partner.
Right, yes.
Yeah, very cool. What about you, Orestis?
Yeah, so I did my PhD in Nottingham, and then I went in the market, and it just happened that Munich had the best offer at the time. Okay. And it was also, so I was actually a bit more exotic in the choices I was considering. The University of Nottingham has a campus in China, in Ningbo.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I was actually seriously considering moving there as an assistant prof, but that was also in the start of the pandemic, and I thought I played a bit more safe, so I chose Munich instead.
China during pandemic was, shall we say, complicated?
It was.
It
was.
Amazing. Okay, so let's start with what you guys have been working on, introducing this study that you've done. That's why you're here. I can just give a little bit, but obviously as Vivino, we've been trying, or we're all sometimes challenged on, hey, yes, you have these ratings, but are they any good? And we've always looked at it and tried to compare it and so on, but we're, somewhat biased and not really scientists. So we're incredibly excited when we heard about you guys doing this without our involvement, which makes it obviously more credible and so on. So that's why you invited you here to talk about that study and other stuff you've done in wine. So who wants to open up with the background of this study?
I can say a couple of words, and then I can pass it over to Orestis. So, of course, a very exciting and interesting question, and actually it requires also approaching it from many different angles and in their disciplinary way. So just also talk a little bit about our collaborators, because the two of us are here, but actually it's a larger team that actually did the research. We collaborate with Ophelia Deroy, who is a philosopher of sensory experience and neuroscientist as well. Okay. Bahadur Bahrami, who is also a neuroscientist and works on group decision making and crowd cognition. Karthikeya Kaushik, who is now a psychology PhD student at UC Berkeley in California. And then last but not least is Stefan Herzog, who is at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, and he's a psychologist, a researcher studying.
A truly global study here from a lot of universities. Amazing.
Yes, that's right. And so that speaks to the fact that, wine is a very complicated matter and it requires a lot of expertise from very different backgrounds. I mean, this is the best way to tackle a question like the one.
And indeed,
related to Vivino.
A very interdisciplinary team, but we all have one thing in common, right? So we are all fascinated in how people make decisions, and especially when the right kind of course of action is not obvious. Maybe there is incomplete information, maybe there is some uncertainty between actions and outcomes. Broadly speaking, this has applications in the financial market, medical decision making, but perhaps more relevant for the discussion today, also to what we call experience goods. These are products that prior to actually tasting them, experiencing them, you don't know if they're any good, right? So
this is the key, and this is the challenge with wine also, is that if you buy apparel, clothes, or something online, for example, right? You can actually visually see it. You can try it on, but you can see it at least, which is like part of the experience. With wine, there is nothing like that. I mean, I cannot taste this thing online, so I have to have some sources, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the good thing is of being in an interdisciplinary team, we have lots of tools on our hands to play around with. And so tools from economics, psychology, even computer science. And one insight that was kind of particularly intriguing for us was what we call the wisdom of the crowd, right? That's the idea that the collective judgment of a big group of people tends to be more accurate than any individual, even if they're an expert, right? An early kind of demonstration of that was with Francis Galton back in the 19th century. He won in a fair in the UK, and there was this guess the weight of a cow contest.
Oh, yeah.
So people would buy a coupon, write down a weigh, and then the person who gets it closer gets the cow. And Galton said, okay, I wonder if I take the average of these guesses, how close would that be? And it was, really accurate, I think just within a pound or so, right?
Wow.
So the crowd got it right. But of course, the question is, can we apply the wisdom of the crowd in picking a wine?
Exactly.
Right? So,
and then picking a wine is a particularly challenging question because, if you think about it, there are just so many things that go into making a good wine. So it is, of course, the terroir, like the geographical location where the vineyards are located, but also the methods, the vinification methods that are applied by the viticulturalist and the winemaker afterwards, right? So a lot of different approaches that you can use to grow the wines that will then go into the winery, that will then, using different approaches, will be transformed eventually into wine. And there are millions of choices that you can make. So it's not an accident, actually, that there are entire degrees dedicated into studying wine. So you can go and study it for years, or you can even do master educations on wine.
Exactly.
This speaks to the complexity.
Yeah, and people have strong preferences too, right? I mean, one thing is like the knowledge about wine, and people have preference on top of that. And if you take your story from the farmer's market, whatever it was, and they ended up actually guessing, like the community guessed it, that does depend a lot on the audience, right? If apparently the people in the audience had some idea, right? I mean, they were not just random people from the street, or maybe they were farmers or something.
That's an excellent point. So the magic of the wisdom of the crowd is that it suffices that you have a little bit of a signal. Like you don't need to be an expert.
Okay.
And then through some other assumptions as well, like some kind of like not super correlated opinions, right? Then the noise that cancels out. So some gets it a bit lower, some get it a bit higher, and the errors tend to cancel out.
Yeah.
But the challenge, so at the end of the day, Galton had the cow. He could actually weigh it and compare it to the average, right? Yeah. We didn't have a cow.
No. We don't. Nobody knows really, right? No.
Exactly, that's the point. So our task was a bit challenging in the sense that, I mean, ultimately wine is about subjective taste.
Yeah.
So
what is the truth?
Yeah, exactly. How do you kind of bifurcate that challenge? Like, how do you overcome that lack of objectivity? And so we spent a lot of time discussing about this and reading, and I think one of the key breakthroughs came thanks to the work of a society, like a community within economics, studying explicitly the wine economics. So this is a research program started in the 80s by Orly Eschenfelter, and now has like even a journal, the journal that we published, that is edited by Karl Storchman. And one of the key insights from that program was the so-called Bordeaux equation, right? And the idea of it, so this is a model that predicts the auction price of Bordeaux wines by using data just from the weather that was present at the year that the grapes were harvested and the age of the wine, right? And the model did surprisingly well in predicting the auction price, better than even the experts did.
When was this? Is it a long time ago, or?
So yeah, that happened like back in the 80s, but of course they kept on tracking the performance of the model over the decades.
There was a lot of discussion back then, right? So because, of course, he was making a very bold claim, so there was a lot of pushback by people involved in the industry. Ossenfelter was claiming that I can unpredict just using objective data. So you can imagine, the back and forth that
experts were not happy about that.
No, that's an understatement. Yeah. But the reason why the model worked so well is that, as it turns out, when you control for other variables such as like the viticulture's techniques and so on, just by tracking the fluctuation of the weather year by year, you can tell a lot about the fluctuation of the quality of the wine, right? And the reason for that is because there's a very well-defined objective relation between the weather parameters and the quality of the grapes that the viticulturists have to work with. And so we thought, that's our idea. That's how we are going to start using objective markers, because the weather is objective, right?
Yes,
it is objectively...
you have data there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we also have very precise expectation as to how the weather in each year affects the quality of the grapes.
Yeah.
And then the question is, if we replace the auction price in this model with Vivino ratings, right? Are Vivino ratings able to kind of capture these weather fluctuations in that same efficient way that the prices did? Right, so that was kind of our first test for the reliability of the ratings.
Yeah, which is super interesting because for many reasons, but Bordeaux is obviously well tracked and so on, but most wines do not go on auction in Bordeaux. So if that turns out to be true, you can do it at a much bigger scale too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly right.
Yeah, and then, that was one way to approach the issue, but then the other approach that we followed was to see how Vivino stacks up against traditional wisdom in the world of wine. And then what has been a very influential source of information was to just follow renowned critics.
Yeah, exactly.
Like Jancis Robinson, Robert Parkett, and now the people that he employs at the Wine Advocate, and James Shackling, you name it.
Yeah.
So we wanted to have two independent methods that we could use so that we could cross-validate in a sense, that we could see if the results check out in both ways. And we examined to what extent the ratings, the average ratings that we get from Vivino are correlated with what the ratings of the expert critics.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, so it's not very easy to get access to those expert ratings. Actually, very often you have to go on their websites. You need to pay something in order to subscribe. So we used a data set that is very peculiar in a sense. So we got data that were en primeur. So this is tastings that happen before the wines go out in the market. They're still in the barrel, typically in the spring. And then the expert critics go in Bordeaux. They taste the wines from the barrel, and then they put up their note about their expectation about what the quality of the wine is going to be.
And you did that because it was available or for other reasons?
So I think availability was a key aspect, but also it's a lot of well-known critics that go down there and then make the tasting. So we both had really good critics, and this is the data that was available for us that we were able to find.
Yeah.
So it's a question, right? So how can we get high quality data from both critics and amateurs? And actually, it's not very easy to find really good quality data in the case of wine.
No.
And I can give another anecdote. There is a famous competition that happened in the 70s, the Paris Judgment, it's called. So maybe you've heard of it.
There are movies made about that.
Yeah, so it's 20 judges that evaluate, or fewer actually, it's a dozen judges that evaluate 20 wines. So it gives us a data set that is not very large, right? Yeah. And has been analyzed so much by the wine economics community and by other people. It speaks to the paucity of the good quality data sets. There aren't that many out there. So Vivino is a trove of data nowadays. It's very hard to find similar quality data from...
back in the day.
Back in the day, or nowadays from critics actually, right? From I think people who have an interest in protecting the information that they provide, because it's
a business too.
It's their business model. Yeah. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you used the judgment in Paris or through.
No. So this is something that the wine economics community has analyzed, right?
Okay.
So that's
you would think it was a little bit too weaker, the data.
Yeah. So So yeah, we used the data that were en primeur.
That was better.
From Bordeaux, from the same years that we're able to find Vivino data. Right?
Okay.
Exactly. So we kind of like restricted we could look for wines all over the world, but as a homage also to the Bordeaux equation, we decided to focus on red wines from Bordeaux.
Okay.
That's another reason why the en primeur tastings of Bordeaux were a good data set to tap from. And so we constructed a portfolio of representative wines, red wines from Bordeaux, and tracked their vintages for several years, and then took the average ratings from Vivino for these wine labels for every vintage.
How many wines did you do?
So it was so it was 60 wine labels that we tracked over 13 vintages. So that's around 800 wines.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. And on top of that, we also collected local weather data from a local weather station in Mérignac. And that was also important for our analysis about how the Vivino ratings fluctuate and capture this kind of objective relations with weather and quality of grapes. So we can enter the drum roll and talk about some results as well.
Yeah, before that, let me do a little bit of a challenge here.
Yeah.
What if the entire Bordeaux equation isn't really true? Because what really happens is that the guys or the people that bid on the auction just look at the weather. So it doesn't say anything about the quality of the wine. It just says what the weather was like.
Well, that's a great question. Very deep and hard philosophical question. And it comes to that notion of endogeneity, right? How do you know that something that you observe is causal?
Yeah.
So in my field, experimental economics, we kind of circumvent this problem by kind of having random assignment to a control and a treatment condition and so on. But here we are working with data in the wild.
Yeah.
So there's no I can tell you about econometric techniques that we use and so on, but ultimately I'll never be able to 100% convince you, but I might be able to persuade you. So, but the more cynical approach would also be, who cares? Like, does it actually predict does it actually work? Is it a useful instrument to use? And it was.
It's perceived as a better wine, at least, right? At that point. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think like when Assenfelter came up with this equation, there was a real shock, right? So there was people were genuinely surprised by his results. So it would, if it creates that amount of surprise, it would also be like a bit unusual if people were already using it. So if the same people that criticized him were using it in order to predict prices. So it came a little bit like in juxtaposition with what these people were doing. Yeah. Right. So.
Okay.
So
cool.
I think there are good reasons to expect that this was something novel at that time.
Of course.
I don't know what happened since then because maybe then some of the critics really started to consult the equation. But like when he first did it, I think it was.
Yeah, exactly. You could say that the first data is more reliable in theory. Because then they start looking anyway. But
Heini, I would expect that you are a numbers person. You would appreciate the fact that we kind of start to move away from this kind of fortune telling of like
subjective BS.
And now we put some numbers in, we crunch them, and we have like a concrete prediction. So.
You guys are preaching to the choir here for sure. There's no doubt. Cool. Let's get the drum roll and let's hear what the studies show.
All right. So let's start with the weather data. So in a nutshell, we were very surprised to see that like Vivino ratings, subjective Vivino ratings, were capturing these underlying weather conditions very, very accurately. Right. So for example, we know that in these kind of more northern latitudes, having higher temperature during the growing season is a good thing. And so we see that the average Vivino ratings on warmer seasons, on warmer vintages, were actually higher than in colder ones.
Amazing.
We also see that it tends, when it rains, especially late in the growing season, like close to harvest time, that's bad news for the grapes for several reasons, including mildew pressure and rot and so on. And so Vivino ratings were also kind of lower. They were capturing that very accurately. Here's where it gets more interesting as well. So this is kind of still exploratory, but we also saw some evidence on what we interpret kind of a potential backfiring effect of climate change, right? So I already mentioned that warmer growing season is better, right? But now when we kind of split the growing season and we focus on the last part of it, right? So like around September, it turns out that when high temperature are prolonged, that has a detrimental effect in the Vivino ratings, right? So
If it gets too warm, it's not good.
too warm for too long,
Yeah.
it backfires.
Okay.
So it's still early to tell. So we are using approximately 10 years of observations from Vivino ratings. So in order to kind of capture these more complicated trends, we would need kind of more years. So please kind of stay in operation.
Yes.
Yeah? but it's something to keep in mind, right? Things are changing, and we are probably already past a tipping point, at least in Bordeaux.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah, so and in terms of correlational analysis, so what we see is that actually we can find strong substantial correlations between the average Vivino ratings and the Imprimer ratings from the critics.
Okay.
And so this is roughly equivalent to what you would get in other domains, even in domains where you have objective answers. So in some domains in agriculture or even in medicine, right? So you have similar correlations among different sources of information or experts. So that's also another good sign that actually the information that is collected in Vivino is reflecting something that's very valuable to many people and in line with the traditional wisdom. And so although the correlation is substantial, is not as high as the correlation of the correlations among the critics themselves, right? And there could be different reasons for that. So it's very close, but a little bit lower. So this might hint to the fact that maybe the Vivino audience has a fundamentally different taste. So it's not very surprising actually, because we have similar results from other domains. If you look at what critics like in cinema and what the audience says, typically there is a discrepancy.
They can be different,
right? And then like a common heuristic that people might use in the wide world. Actually, this heuristic has been around before. Is like try to find your preferred critic and then follow that person, but you can generalize to the preferred source of information. So, maybe the source of information provided by Vivino is very valuable for very many people in the way that when you go to IMDb, then this information is very, very valuable and many people consult it and they would actually prefer it from other information that you could get from critics. Yeah. And now we're in the process of developing a methodology actually for do this type of analysis, but this is a future project. This is work that is ongoing. But we have some hunches why it could be that we have these differences in correlations, right? So very substantial, strong correlations, but there seem also to be a source of the difference.
Yeah, no, I think from our side, the reason why we started Vivino was not because of the quality of the ratings that were out there. We always felt the quality that was out there was good. Like Robert Parker, who sort of revolutionized this and came up with the scale and all, there was never anything wrong with the quality and still isn't. The problem was the scalability. The problem was that when you walk into a supermarket anywhere in the world, like 2% of the wines are actually rated. So having proof that we also have that quality and then you scale it to every single wine in the world, I mean, that's a major win for crowdsourcing and us, obviously.
Yeah.
Right, and if you look at all these famous critics, right? So they can evaluate a few wines a day,
and
then that amounts to a few thousand wines a year. Even
I have those numbers for you.
Oh,
so
right.
Roughly, these experts they do 10 to 20,000 a year.
Oh my God!
But that's the entire company, like Advocate and so on. But we do 100,000 a day.
Wow!
Right. So the scales it's just different, right?
Yeah, exactly. But more than availability, you might have a distinct voice.
Yes.
So people might prefer to go after a wine recommendation from Vivino than from an expert. And our analysis suggests that there might be a good reason to do so, right? So this is a result that in the beginning we kind of looked over, but then we had like a switch of the light, and we thought, oh, that's really interesting. So one thing that we observed. So okay. I'll give you the result, and then I'm going to talk a bit about how we came to that conclusion. So from our analysis, it looks like experts, or I should say professional critics, because there might be experts in Vivino as well, have a different scope when evaluating a wine compared to the average Vivino rating, right? So as it turns out, the Vivino rating is focusing on what's good right now, right? So they are leaving a score based on the hedonic experience that they had
At
when
that
they
moment.
at the moment.
Yeah.
Exactly. As we see, as our analysis suggests, the experts are actually doing something slightly different. They're actually giving a forecast.
Yeah.
When they're tasting the wine, they're thinking, how good will it taste at its peak?
Especially on the Bordeaux example, right? When you
Exactly.
Yeah.
And thank you for bringing this up, because this is where we briefly talk about tannins, right? And that these are like this kind of polyphenolic molecules that are in wine, basically, especially in red wine, and especially in red wine from Bordeaux, right? And when they're young, these agents, they tend to give this very astringent taste, similar to kind of like leaving a black tea over brew, right?
Yeah.
And that can be unpleasant for some people, right? So the experts say, okay, as the years go by, these tannins are becoming silkier and smoother, and the wine is becoming more enjoyable.
Yeah.
So, so the way we see that, but if the amateur raters are focusing on what's good right now, they might kind of judge the wine that is young a bit more harshly.
Yeah.
So the way this came up actually is, so we observe the date that the review was posted, right? And then we can take that as a proxy for when the wine was consumed, and take the difference with the year of the vintage of the wine, right? And then we kind of measure the age of the wine at the date of consumption.
Yeah.
Right. So what would you expect, right? Are older wines rated more positively? Is age having a positive impact?
I would think so.
We did as well, and that's what we see.
Yeah.
Right? And we said, oh, great, that's yet another piece of evidence that the Vivino users or the Vivino ratings are capturing what we expect from wine.
Yeah, the quality increases over time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that also tells us something about kind of the way that they do these ratings, right? If they were making forecasts, right? If they weren't judging how good it tastes right now, right, then the average impact of age should be around 0. Sometimes they would overestimate the potential, sometimes they would underestimate it, right? That's what we see from experts actually. When we consider the denotations that experts do over the years, on average that's 0, because they always do this forecast. Sometimes they're up, sometimes they're...
So they actually hit it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they update, right? So like year after year, they might reopen the wine label and then reassess the quality of the wine and then say something about when it's going to peak.
Okay.
But on average, the errors cancel out, actually.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that with the experts, they're trying to predict it, so that line is kind of flat.
Exactly.
Where the users are sort of catching up with it, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
And that has implications as well. So like if you care primarily of buying a wine and tasting it on that night, right? You're invited over for dinner with your friends. And you want to bring a wine. Do you follow this kind of highbrow expert and with risking that the wine is tasting very astringent today, or do you go with a Vivino rating? So I mean, what
you should do, let's say if this is very early, right, before it's released, and there's an expert, there's 5 Vivino users, it sounds like what you should be doing is take the expert's rating as is, and then put a multiplier on the Vivino. Just add a little bit too, because that is they're gonna grow into that. So what is 4.1 at the early days is gonna turn into a 4.3, but the expert's gonna say 4.3 right away.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the hypothesis at least.
Okay.
Yeah, but this is future research that one could do using your data, right? So like and the longer you stay in operation, the more exciting it becomes, because
the more accurate it becomes.
Yeah.
Okay. Amazing.
But you know, also maybe this is something for you, right? So maybe you can have badges about something that is expected to grow, right? So improve over time. So actually, critics do a little bit of that in their websites. If you go and look at their tasting notes, they say when a wine is expected to peak, maybe, you know, looking at your data, you could do something similar actually in the future.
Yeah, I mean, especially when people drink wines that are, you would say it's too early. Like you're drinking a Bordeaux now, and you should be drinking 10 years from now. If that gets a decent rating, we can say, oh, like, this one's going to be good.
Yeah.
This one is going to be good at some point, if it gets this higher rating already. So there could be something there for sure.
Potentially, you could also ask people, like, not as the first thing they do, but like, do you want to give us some more information? Like, can you make a forecast? Like, is this gonna go
Up or down?
Up or down?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's interesting too.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so I want to talk about one thing. This research is, I mean, it's super interesting, and it's kind of interesting to keep following it, right? So we're excited to do that. One thing I wanted to ask you guys a little bit about, because you're experts in this field and in field and behavior and so on. Our ratings, people rate incredibly civilized and well, meaning distribution of our ratings is really quite pretty. You did a specific one, so it's going to be a little bit narrow. There's going to be highly rated, but when you look at it people don't rate just 1 and 5. People actually really rate and use the entire scale. It's got a beautiful distribution, and that's not the case when people do restaurants or other things. What do you say about that? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, right? So, okay, so there is an entire science, and there is a lot of work that goes into what makes like a rating that you can trust online, right? So, for instance, we know that in other websites there are problems with fraud in restaurants, yes. Right? So, like people might put reviews to boost their business, or actually competitors might also put reviews in order to harm a particular business. And this is something that we know there is active research on that. There is also a potential that you might be a little bit influenced from what other people say.
So self-fulfilling.
Right, to some extent. So, and there is also active research on that. Actually, we're doing a project with colleagues right now to evaluate to what extent this can be self-fulfilling or not. Turns out that there are conditions where the ratings are mostly self-correcting, and there are like some other conditions
there in the end.
More rare where you have this path dependency. So I think like probably the community, the people that drink wine and the people that like to rate wine, they're just more kind in general as compared to the average person going to a restaurant. But also maybe you have more factors like the service that you might get there, right? So some people are frustrated about that.
My theory has always been that you don't get as mad at a bottle of wine as you do at a waiter. All right? I mean, it's just more emotional that that guy was a dick. I'm going to give them 1 star, right? And if the wine isn't very good, we'll just give it a 3 star. Or something, right? So that's sort of my take.
I have a hypothesis, just speaking out loud. So one thing that we've noticed is, and it's kind of commonly known, is that different cultures have different habits or different norms as to how you rate.
For sure.
So, for example, in Japan, rating something with the perfect score is an exaggeration, right? It's kind of like you need to be more moderate. Like typically, actually, when you use this kind of apps to find a restaurant in Japan, if something is too exaggerated, then it's probably a tourist trap, because Japanese people wouldn't have scored it that high. Now, the thing with Vivino, and that speaks to the international scope of the app, is that it is used by all cultures around the world. And so part of the reason why you might get that more representative range of ratings is because so you don't have just one culture which kind of truncates the ratings within a range, but now you get it from all over the world and you get everything in this kind of distribution.
And if I was going to challenge that, I would say yes, but the sample sizes are very different depending on, right? So let's assume Americans rate a little bit higher than the Germans.
Right.
And then the sample size of American wines are more Americans would rate that. Then you could argue that American wine or Vivino has a high rating that's a little bit too high. And German wine maybe a little bit too low.
Yeah, absolutely. But I was thinking more about wines that are like a wine from Bordeaux that is
totally
consumed
global.
International.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, but you're right. It's a different thing when you look at different nationalities of wines. And so,
This is also, I think, a great idea for future research, actually, right? So if you had the data and the
if you could normalize that or something.
Yeah. Exactly. So
stratified by culture, and both in terms of the nationality of the reviewer, but also on the nationality of the viticulturist.
So this is something that we intuitively do in academia, right? So if you get recommendations for a student, if it's from an American supervisor, it tends to be a glowing recommendation. But if it's a Dutch or a German supervisor,
it's different.
They tend to be
What
very
about
grumpy.
Finland? I mean, I'll be worried.
Just because they wrote the letter is enough. You know, they don't even
yeah, amazing. Very cool. So what else should we cover here? We've been through quite a bit here. Anything we missed?
No, I think that was a fair summary of our paper. And thank you for the very kind of insightful questions as well that helped us unravel kind of our thoughts. It's the first time we really kind of go public with the ideas of this paper, and to us it's like super interesting that like you read the paper and we were able to reach out to you and to the community. Hopefully, we might want to just very briefly talk about like future steps. All right,
Yeah,
so like
exactly.
ideas that we are currently working on.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm fascinated with, especially in the emergence of the large language models, is so far we took kind of these aggregate numerical scores.
Yeah.
But one thing that I would find interesting to see is how useful do people find aggregated textual reviews? So now we can take an LLM and ask it, okay, here's like 1,000 reviews of this wine. Can you distill a summary of that kind of more qualitative features of the experience of consuming that wine? And summarize it, and this could, like, as you see the average rating, it could feature like an average textual review next to it, right? And it can happen very cheaply and easily. And one thing, of course, as a behavioral economist, I'm also interested in the psychology of things. Are people finding more or less useful or trustworthy a review knowing that it has been written by an LLM versus a human, right? So these are kind of questions that we are interested in.
That's going to be very interesting to see too, right? Because we're going to see a lot of that. And, you know, LLMs can't be used for everything, but they are pretty damn good at summarizing stuff, I would say, generally, right? It's really good tool there, yeah.
Yeah, and well, at the moment it's a low-hanging fruit, right? So like it's relatively easy nowadays to implement something like that computationally, right? So it's maybe a good perspective looking forward.
Yeah.
But also, so I mean, this research is ongoing, so we have other projects that are coming out. So maybe in the future
we'll be back on here.
Yes,
we're excited to hear what's coming up. Yeah,
and also like keep an eye for our collaborators, because also they are doing fantastic work. So
Amazing.
If you want to talk to philosopher of wine, then Ophelia de Roy is a great person to.
There's a full team there ready.
Yeah.
Fantastic, guys! Thank you very much for coming. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Hani.
That's a wrap for today. Pantelis and Orestis, thank you very much for coming and sharing your insights today. It's been a very exciting conversation. For all of you listening, let us know what you think. We'll have links in the description to all the research done here. If you have ideas on what we should cover in future episodes, please send us an email at podcast@vivino.com. As always, comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you very much for listening.